And traders.
The Oakland Raiders and the
San Francisco Traders.
Yes, around the Irish Bears. Yes.
All right, Taylor.
Yeah. Vikings didn't seem to have much influence in this area compared to some of the other areas talked about in the book.
Yeah.
There were specific locations, though. For example, Dublin was settled in 841.
Certainly. Well, here's one thing. There were no cities in Ireland until the Vikings got there.
No. It was...
So I think that's an influence.
Yeah. It started off as just a trading center, which I found interesting. But later on, they began raiding in the early 10th century. They ended up becoming center of slave trade in the Irish Sea region by the mid-10th. And in the 1160s, this is well after the quote-unquote Viking Age. It was conquered by the Normans. Strangely enough, all of the buildings in Dublin were attributed to the Norse because they said that the Irish were inept builders.
Whoa!
And were not able to build. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And who made that statement? The English?
The Normans.
Yeah. That's what I figured.
So, but keep in mind the Normans are descendants of the Norse, so they will probably have some favor towards...
but this is the overall prejudice against the Irish.
Yeah.
They can't build anything. All right.
I'm not offended.
They're always getting drunk.
See, there you go. They're
Starting fights.
They keep piling all the Irish. Irish need not apply. Okay, keep going.
And then there's Wales. Not too much interest in heritage in Wales.
What?
Most of the focus are on the Celtic.
Well, not interested in Viking heritage.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the Welsh are very interested in heritage.
Yes, they're interested in
Overall.
heritage, just not specifically the Viking heritage.
Yes.
There's not too many.
Saying is there wasn't a
Yeah. There were some interactions though. In 852, Singin of Powys, he was killed by Gentiles. That is believed to mean Vikings. Perhaps it doesn't.
Gentiles
clearly
as
state.
opposed to Christians,
Yeah.
not Jews. Okay.
Probably
So
not. Pagans, but the term used was Gentiles, and so
Really?
it is assumed, we can't say 100%, certain.
Sometimes
but most
I'll
likely.
come into a room and I'll say ladies and Gentiles, but I think that means something different. Okay, keep going.
Around 950, they started raiding after the death of Hywel Dda, or Da, maybe, I don't know how the Welsh pronounce things.
That's
It's
tough.
stupid. Like, it is so stupid. Like, that double L is pronounced
Yeah.
S.
Wow.
It's difficult.
Well, I might not try then. And then about 987 to 1002, they continued to raid South Wales, but eventually they were paid tribute to stop the raiding, and so they stopped raiding. The one site that there seems to be some influence of some sort was Red Wharf Bay, near Sanderbedgroch, something along those lines. They found a lot of silver hoards there. They found some people buried with their hands tied behind their backs, possibly victims of raids. One of them was a young child, and the other was a male adult. On the other hand, we have the Isle of Man. I love their flag.
You like that? Three legs?
In my high school, on the third floor, we'd walk around and they'd have flags of a bunch of different countries. They had the American flag next to the North Korean flag, which I found hilarious. But they had 3 flags, 3 Isle of Man flags. I don't know why. They just had to put 3 in there.
Well, it has 3 legs, so you need 3 flags.
Maybe.
You just appreciate the fact that there's a place called the Isle of Man.
I know. Not the Isle of Woman.
No.
Not
the Isle of Woman, but the Isle of Man.
Or He-Man.
No.
Or She-Ra. Not the Island of She-Ra.
Don't you start. That's
The Island of He-Man. Okay, go ahead.
So, on contrary to the Welsh, the Manx do have a lot of pride in their Viking heritage.
Okay.
Their parliament, Tynwald, is very much like an open-air assembly like the Norse. They would have open discussion. And their language, although it is, I believe, does have aspects of Celtic in it, does have a lot of Norse influence as well.
The Isle of Man.
There's not too many excavated sites. There's a lot of either building on top of it or I think like sand dunes or something like that. The primary way that we get information, kind of like ancient Egypt, or burials. That's where most of our information is from them. They found about 25 burial sites.
Burials are good.
They found a boat burial at Bassadul and chamber graves at Basseterre, and those are believed to be around 9th to 10th centuries. These burials were very much our stereotypical Viking burials in terms of they're all clad up and in their uniform, everything that they need for Valhalla. So that's kind of the image that we imagine of Viking burials, and the few that we have in the Isle of Man is that stereotype. And there are over 300 cist burials. There aren't any grave goods, but no Scandinavian clothing, so a bit confusion how that relates to Viking.
And no reason for the 3 legs.
I want to learn what that is.
Yeah. That's pretty
interesting.
neat. I like that, the 3 legs. Must be an island of runners.
Maybe.
That way you don't get slowed down by your body. Very easy to go down hills that way, too. So Paxton's going to talk about Chapter 11. So you know what that means, bankruptcy. All right. Come on up. I think the thing to do is just to scroll this little, see this little thing? You could just do this. No, not that. Do this.
Okay.
Just roll this little thing there. Okay. All right. Chapter 11 about the Vikings. Paxton.
Alrighty. So I did chapter 11 about the Vikings, which is about how they landed in Greenland and whatnot. And Viking called Eric the Red led the Vikings to a remote island, and Greenland was also isolated. And in 300 AD, the Icelanders on 25 ships had headed to Greenland, and only 14 of the original ships made the trip to Greenland with Eric the Red when they were sailing to Greenland. And
25 ships headed to Greenland, but only 14 ships made the trip.
Yeah, to Greenland. Yeah, anyways. And the Vikings had split into 2 groups. The larger group had settled to the southwest coast of Greenland, which would later become known as the Eastern Settlement, and the Western Settlement was founded by the second group, which was smaller. And the settlers were farmers and occupied Greenland from the 11th to 12th century, and it's estimated that there were between 2,000 and 400 settlers during that time in the Greenland colonies. And farming was sometimes a challenge because the farmers' domestic animals had to be kept inside because of extreme winters. And farmers depended on seals for meat and their skins and ivory for trading with Iceland and all of Europe. And excavation of the farms provided, this is a thing where this is possibly still a Viking, settlement or whatever, house from back then, and the excavation of the farms provides some information about what the farms may have been like, and this is the closest thing they can come to. So, and one of these had 38 rooms, and 12 looked like they had still been in use during the last years of occupation and settlement in Greenland. The buildings were built from timber and driftwood. Some of the wood was imported from a place called Vinland, Siberia, which is obviously in Russia, and in Norway, obviously. And there was no furniture discovered because they probably took it with them and they left and went to North America. So, well, they're colonists, the Vikings. What do you expect? So,
sure.
Yeah. So, and also some people try to give credit to the Vikings for discovering America before Columbus. I mean, in all fairness, they did they didn't name America yet, but they did land in, the continent of North America before Columbus, so.
Exactly.
And evidence is pretty limited, but however, the evidence is pretty limited, obviously, because it was an older time, and the reality is that the Vikings discovered America is probably more of a myth instead of a fact, so.
Well, they named the whole thing after me. Wineland.
True.
This whole continent is named after me, so just keep that in mind.
Right. And the truth could.
Wineland.
And however, there could be still some truth that could still be somewhere in the myths and heard and what evidence is known, obviously, because there's Leif Erikson and whatnot. So
Maybe I'm a Viking.
yeah, maybe. And there appears to be two accounts of the Vikings becoming, Greenlanders, and one of these was a book called Greenlander Saga, which was written in 1200, and Eric's, that's how I pronounce his name, Eric's Saga, which was written in 1210 to 1230 AD. And the discovery of Vinland is given to, I can't pronounce his name, Bjarni Herjolfsson, when he got off course and found the land southwest of Greenland.
Yeah. And he named it Wineland.
And in the year 1000 AD, yours truly, Leif Erikson, Eric the Reed's son, goes to explore the land his father found, and the place he explores he names Helluland, Markland, and Vinland.
Or Wineland.
And also in Eric's saga, Thorfinn Karlsefni, who is an Icelander trader, is given credit for exploring the new land, and is believed that Vinland is Newfoundland, which is in Canada, obviously. Maybe you're Canadian,
I'm a Canadian.
Yeah.
Secretly.
And the discovery of Leon's Yucks Meadows by our archaeologists give proof that more proof of the Vikings settling in North America. And John Cabot rediscovered Newfoundland in 1497. And there is a gap between the Greenland colonists in Newfoundland and John Cabot exploring Newfoundland between these two time periods. And it is believed that the western settlement in Greenland ended sometime in the mid 14th century. And the last accounts of the eastern settlement were in 1406 when a crew from Norway was driven to Greenland by a storm. And the crew lived with farmers in the eastern settlement that had already been there for 4 years, or they lived there with them for 4 years. So
4 years.
Yeah. And why did the Viking colonies fail as opposed to Columbus? The colonies failed possibly because of the climate changes causing the caribou to migrate and resulting in grazing deterioration. And it is observed that there was a decline in vegetation that could have been caused by overgrazing by the Norsemen. Another possible reason is that the Greenlanders had health issues of disease, malnutrition, which obviously happened a lot back then for the colonists. So, and the Black Death could have also been responsible for wiping out the Greenlanders. Yeah, they could have spread it from Europe to Greenland. And another possibility is that trade with India and Russia was strong, so it affected the Greenland colonies, so it was probably an economic problem. And another reason for the failure could have been caused by the competition with the native Inuit people that had lived there, just like how Native Americans are to the United States and whatnot. However, there is not much evidence of Inuit artifacts in this area. A reasonable factor could have been simply that the Norse just couldn't adapt to the land here, so they couldn't take it. So, and another important influence on, and this is another picture of what the Scandinavian settlement buildings could have possibly looked like. So this is the closest we'll get. And another important influence on the Norse was church and Christianity, and there was over 20 local churches that were built, and there was evidence at the Garor where there were 9 partial skeletons of hunting dogs found. And this was during the mid-14th century, and implies that there was no one left in the colony. And it also appears that the 14th century the settlers starved, which I see as a huge possibility. And the Vikings were not able to obviously last in the Greenland colonies, so yeah.
All right. Thank you. Have any questions or comments? It's all right. Okay. So it's good to hear about, how this whole continent was named after me. That's my story. All right. Here's our presentation from our textbook chapter.
So my Collins chapter was essentially about the beginning of the Spanish Reconquista. And buckle in, gents, because it is a confusing ride. So the story of the Spanish Reconquista begins in the early 700s with the Islamic Caliphate. At that time, the Islamic Caliphate was one of the largest empires in the world that stretched from all the way from Central Asia through North Africa. And in Morocco, their immediate neighbor was the Visigoth Kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, which is the geographic term for the area of Spain and Portugal, but it was traditionally called Hispania by the Romans and the Visigoths. And the Romans were long gone from that area, and it was now the kingdom of the Visigoths. However, the Visigoths were suffering from political instability and multiple civil wars. And in 711, the Muslims, well, let me back up a bit. It's important to note that at this time period, the family that ruled the Islamic Caliphate was the Umayyad dynasty, because they believed that they were the rightful heirs to the Prophet Muhammad. Thus, they should rule the emperor. They should rule the caliphate as the caliphs in succession. So, in an effort to expand more, they took advantage of the Visigothic instability and sent an army of about 12,000 Arabs and Berbers from Morocco across the Straits of Gibraltar to Iberia, led by General Tariq ibn Ziyad. And as I said, the Visigothic kingdom was severely weakened by competing royal families, but the disputed king Roderick mustered as many troops as he possibly could to repulse the invasion. The Visigoths attacked the Umayyad army near the Guadalete River far south, but they were decisively defeated, allowing the Umayyads to march further into Iberia and captured the Visigoth capital of Toledo. And the major reason why the Visigoths lost so easily is just because they haphazardly threw an army together, and too many of them were far under-equipped, some with like farming tools as weapons, and they had no real way to counter the Umayyad cavalry, because the Umayyads came in fully loaded with heavy infantry, heavy and light cavalry, and archers, the whole shebang for conquering a kingdom. So the Visigoths just never really mustered a credible defense against that. By 719, the Umayyad army had conquered all of the Visigoth provinces in Iberia, and once they had done so, the Caliphate established the Emirate of Al-Andalus in Iberia, based in the capital city of Cordoba. Andalus was just the name that they called Iberia for the entire time that they ruled it. And what's interesting, though, is that the Umayyad government seemed to ignore the northwestern corner of Iberia that you can kind of see on that map that's not green. And it was this corner of Iberia that was still ruled by Visigoth Christians after the Umayyads conquered it. And at some point in either 1718 or 722, a Visigoth noble named Pelagius, who possibly escaped the Battle of Guadalete, led an uprising in the region of Asturias and destroyed the Umayyad garrison near the city of Covadonga. The interesting thing about this is that the Christian sources say this was a great battle, but the Muslim sources say it was just a tiny garrison that was sent there and wasn't really meant to occupy anything. Either way, this was a major turning point, because this is considered the beginning of the Reconquista, because Pelagius established the kingdom of Asturias without any major retribution from the Umayyads. But this was most likely because the Umayyads were focusing much of their wars against the Franks. More on that later. And in 739, Pelagius was succeeded by his son-in-law Alfonso the Catholic, who began expanding the kingdom into the parallel provinces of Galicia and Basque, which had not been conquered by the Umayyads. And there were other kingdoms near them that were much smaller and less powerful, but the Asturians were able to assert their influence over them in order to create a strong defense network against the Muslims. Alfonso's successors expanded their border southwards to the mountain range of Sierra de Guadarrama, which was a natural barrier that separated them from Andalus. However, despite multiple border wars, the Asturians could not make a large-scale expansion into Andalus due to a lack of manpower and logistical strength, while the Umayyads were simply too focused on invading Francia to really give any attention to them, which you could argue definitely came back to haunt them centuries down the road. So after the Umayyads had conquered Iberia in 719, they crossed over the Pyrenees mountain range to take the last Visigoth province of Septimania, which is shown in red on that map, and they captured its capital city of Narbonne. From there, they began launching raids into the Duchy of Aquitaine, which was a semi-autonomous Frankish duchy. And as they began raiding into it, they besieged its capital city of Toulouse, which continued until 721, when Duke Odo of Aquitaine launched a devastating attack on their camps and at least half their army, and temporarily checked their incursions into Aquitaine. The Umayyads controlled all of Septimania by 725. At about that time, the new governor of Cordoba, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was emboldened by their success in Aquitaine and decided to lead a massive invasion force in 732 and destroyed Duke Odo's army at the Garonne River. But their success started to become nightmarish very fast, because it's important to understand that the majority of the Muslim army in Andalus was made up of Berbers from North Africa, and Berbers had only recently been Islamicized, and even though technically under Islam they were all equal, the Arabs were still first-class citizens, everybody else was second-class citizens. And the many Berber garrisons around North Africa and Andalus eventually got fed up with the way their Arab officers treated them, and many of them began a series of revolts in Andalus in 732. It became such a problem that the Caliphate had to dispatch a relief force all the way from Syria to crush the revolts. But their presence just caused more friction with the Arabs. Not only that, but in 749, the continuous string of revolts across the Caliphate led to the overthrow of the Umayyad dynasty by the Abbasid dynasty. The Abbasids essentially disputed the Umayyad claim to being the heirs of Muhammad and just overthrew their government and killed them all, or at least as many as they could find. This breakdown of authority temporarily allowed Al-Andalus to exist semi-independently, but between 750 and 756, a surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty named Abd al-Rahman escaped the massacre of his family in Syria and traveled all the way to Andalus, where he led a rebellion against the independent government and declared himself emir as an independent government from the Caliphate. So, just so you get that, he overthrew an independent government that was separate from the Islamic Caliphate, only to establish an independent government that was separate from the Islamic government. Sound convoluted? I know, because
it was Islamic.
It was Islamic, but it was separate from the Caliphate.
Exactly.
Like I said, this is what I meant by it gets confusing. So, but either way, by 756, Al-Rahman firmly established the Emirate of Cordoba as a completely separate Islamic entity from the rest of the Islamic world, which is kind of unheard of at that time. He refused to recognize the authority of the Abbasid Caliphate since they killed all his family, and it took him 20 years to actually bring all of Andalus under his control because of the multiple. He had to take out any warlords who opposed him, but either way, he made Cordoba a separate Islamic emirate. And it was about this time the Muslims were still fighting the Franks, and following his defeat at the Garonne River, Duke Odo of Aquitaine reached out to the Frankish Prince Charles for support as the Umayyad army under Al-Ghafiqi marched closer and closer to the sacred Frankish city of Tours. And so Charles brought the largest army he could get together and led them south and absolutely destroyed the Umayyad army outside of Tours, killing Al-Ghafiqi himself. It was this victory that gave Charles the name Charles the Hammer. And ironically, he was able to defeat Al-Ghafiqi's army by keeping his main force occupied in the field, but then sending half of his army around their flank and destroyed their camp from behind. And then Al-Ghafiqi himself was swarmed and killed by multiple.
Something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And then Al-Ghafiqi himself was swarmed and killed by multiple Frankish warriors. And then when all the other officers saw their commander dead, they all ran. The interesting thing about the Battle of Tours is that some Arab sources claim that Al-Ghafiqi's army was only a raiding party, not really meant to stay there. But I'm just thinking, why would he lead such a massive expedition if they were just going to raid and get out? Tours is pretty far up into Francia. They wanted something. So that's just my argument to that. Over the next 20 years, the Franks gradually pushed the Umayyads back to Narbonne and Aquitaine, and Charles the Hammer's heir, Pepin the Short, sieged the city of Narbonne from 752 to 759 until the Umayyad army finally abandoned it after 40 years of occupation and retreated back into Iberia. And this is where it gets particularly confusing. In 850, King Ordonio of Asturias began expanding the kingdom's borders south of the Guadarrama Mountains towards the Roman fortress of Leon. Now, the Asturian expansion was largely possible due to the increasing instability of the Cordoba Emirate, which was rocked by multiple revolts. The most important one at this time was that of Musa ibn Musa al-Khawasi, yeah, try saying that name 5 times fast, who in 859 rebelled against the authority of Cordoba and established his own emirate and in the fortress of Albelda in the Ebro Valley. This essentially created a third kingdom of Iberia. His new autonomous emirate was short-lived when Ordonio of Asturias led his army down and destroyed his fortress at Albelda. So much for that idea. By 910, King Alfonso III of Asturias repopulated the fortress of Leon as his new kingdom, thus establishing the Kingdom of Leon. And in 920, the Emirate of Cordoba finally began to regain sufficient power in order to threaten Leon. So, Ordonio II of Leon allied with the other Christian kingdom of Navarre to resist Cordoban expansion. However, the Cordoban army under Abd al-Rahman III destroyed the Christian army in an unknown valley called Junquera. I don't have any pictures of this because there's very little record of it. Both the Christian and Arab chronicles are extremely vague when it comes to these events. By 929, Ar-Rahman III declared himself Caliph of Cordoba, thus making Cordoba a completely separate caliphate from the Abbasid Caliphate. See what I mean by this just getting so convoluted? There are now essentially 2 caliphates, and I've actually heard that it was the Caliphate or Cordoba that really fostered the Renaissance culture in Europe. Anyway, that's a separate tangent. By 939, Ar-Rahman led a massive expedition to the Leonese-ruled Douro Valley, but King Ramiro II of Leon joined forces with Count Fernan Gonzalez of Castilla, which was a semi-independent county, and decimated their invasion force outside of Simancas. There are really no details of this battle at all. And can't really see. And after this happened, King Ramiro granted Castilla independence from Leon as payment for their assistance. Thus led to the rise of the Kingdom of Castilla. However, as these Christian kingdoms were starting to become separate, Cordoba was kind of falling apart with so many different wealthy lords vying for control. But between 981 and 1002, one warlord named Abu Amir Muhammad finally defeated all of his rivals in Cordoba and set himself up as the sole ruler of Andalus, and he gave himself the title Al-Mansur, which is Arabic for the victorious. It's then said that he led 57 successful campaigns into the Christian kingdoms of the north and reclaimed much of the Douro Valley, which was right in the center of Iberia. And although he was very successful in this and took much reconquered land from the Christians, this had the consequence of unifying the rival Christian houses against Cordoba. Al-Mansur died at about 1002, and after that, the Cordoba Caliphate fractured into multiple warring principalities after Al-Mansur's grandson, Abd al-Rahman, yes, another guy with the name Abd al-Rahman, just to make it even more confusing, but his grandson tried to usurp the authority of the actual succeeding caliph. Thus, Cordoba descended into absolute madness and was now multiple separate Islamic kingdoms, all fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Christians. This is what I meant by it gets really confusing. But at this time, King Alfonso V of Leon recaptured the lost territory that Al-Mansur had taken, and as a result of the new unity and Muslim fracturing. Sorry, I know I worded that wrong. The point is, the Muslims were increasingly fracturing apart, whereas the Christian kingdoms were becoming more and more unified, giving them an advantage over the Muslims. By 1037, Count Ferdinand of Castilla became King of Leon, unifying both of these kingdoms into one. This marked arguably the most major turning point of the Reconquista, because the Kingdom of Castilla would be the leading Christian power in Iberia that waged continuous wars against the Muslim principalities for the rest of the Reconquista. And I really don't have time to go into the rest of the Reconquista because it goes on all the way until 1492, and the chapter doesn't even cover that much. It essentially stops at the point where Ferdinand becomes king of both Leon and Castilla. But essentially from 1037 to 1492, from King Ferdinand's coronation, the Reconquista continued for 465 more years. For 770 years in total. This wasn't just a war. This was an age of war. It went on through the high middle... It started in the early Middle Ages, escalated in the high Middle Ages, and continued all the way into the very end of the Middle Ages. And an interesting thing to note is that in 1038, King Alfonso Henriques founded the Kingdom of Portugal, which is why Portugal is now separate from Spain. And from 1482 to 1492, the final war of the Reconquista was fought between the Castilla-Aragon Union and the Emirate of Granada, which was the last Muslim kingdom left standing. By 1492, the fall of Granada marked the end of Muslim rule in Iberia and the foundation of the kingdom that we now know as Spain. But just think about it for a second. 770 years. It's almost 1,000 years of just constantly fighting. And in the end of it, Spain and Portugal emerged by 1492. And if you really think about it, 1492 was the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed to South America.
The ocean blue.
Yep. Point is, this was a very crazy time period and very interesting, so I encourage you to look it up further. That's all.
Any questions? All right, yes, that was very good. Thank you.
Plus, I can't tell you how maddening it was to research that.